Talk to yourself like you would to someone you love. Brené Brown. This is Trevor D, and you're listening to Miss Jaye, the Renovation.
Alexa, how can I be happier?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, me either. Episode 4, The Crazy Cat Lady's Guide to Life.
Can I just give up now, please? I want to tell you a story. Recently, I matched with somebody on Tinder. His profile said that he was 34, which is younger than me, but still in that comfortable range. He messaged me first, and unlike a lot of people that I've matched with on the app, he was actually respectful, kind of charming, cute in a goofy, oddball ginger sort of way, and his conversation never felt creepy. He told me that he had just started working at a car dealership, even though he didn't really know a lot about cars. I made some jokes about car salesmen telling me about V8s and thinking it was vegetable juice. He seemed to think that I was funny, and I thought he was attentive and seemed like a really great guy. His profile said that he was from Fargo, which is about an hour away from where I live, and we met right before I was about to leave for a 6-week business trip to Arizona. And so even though I didn't have a chance to meet him before I left, we kept talking back and forth through the app. I told him about this podcast and my other show, Janessa After Dark, and he seemed really excited. He told me that he loved podcasts, and he had always wanted to have a podcast, but he didn't really have an idea for one. I told him, hey, if you're interested in it, you should try it. It's super easy, it's low cost to get started, and regardless of what kind of audience it builds, there's always going to be somebody who's interested in listening. One of the last messages that I got from him, he told me that he had finally come up with an idea for his podcast, but he didn't tell me what it was. On Christmas Eve, I sent him a message saying hello and wishing him happy holidays, and then I didn't hear anything back. On January 1st, I sent him a Happy New Year message, and again, nothing. And even though I didn't understand it because our conversations had always been engaging and interesting, I was pretty sure I was being ghosted. I went through a lot of the typical emotions that someone goes through when they're being ghosted by somebody that they've started to develop an interest in. I was a little bit pissed, but I was also kind of sad. I thought it seemed like I really had a connection with this guy. He was so different from so many of the other people that I had met on Tinder, and I was sad that for whatever reason, that conversation wasn't continuing. Flash forward to Monday, January 28th. It's my last day in Atlanta after Days of the Dead. I brought my bags down to the valet and went back upstairs to the restaurant to have lunch. As I was eating my spicy chicken sandwich, I was scrolling through Facebook, and I noticed a post from somebody who lives in Fargo who's on my friends list. The guy sitting next to her in the picture looked really familiar, and as I was looking at it, I realized it was the guy from Tinder. It was the guy that I had been talking to, the guy that ghosted me. And as I was reading the post, that's when I realized that he had died. In the Sex and the City episode that is my life, once again, the universe reminds me that I will always be a Miranda.
Stood up at 27, Miranda had done nothing. At 34, she decided she wasn't going to take the stand-up lying down. Will may have given her the cold shoulder, but he had also given her his home number.
Hello?
Hi, is Will there?
Who's speaking, please?
Miranda Hobbs.
Miranda, this is Will's mother.
Will's mother. I don't know how you raised your son, but he just stood me up for a date.
Will died today.
They're starting to die on us.
Oh, my God. Well, at least you weren't stood up.
35, and they're dying. We should just give up now.
Well, on the bright side, this could explain why they don't call back.
I've always felt pretty unlucky in love, but this is the first time that my interest in someone has ever led to an actual fatality. And I don't mean to make light of it, and I certainly don't want to put out the impression that I'm making a joke about the fact that this guy passed away. But it was just such interesting synchronicity that this all happened as I was working on this particular book for the renovation. And I think that I was dreading this book because I have been sort of all over the place in terms of how I think about relationships and how I feel about being single and the relationships that I've been in. So while I was certainly nervous to see what was in store with this book, I was also ready to think about relationships and dating and sex and all of that in new and hopefully more productive ways. Part 1. Who's afraid of the crazy cat lady? So before we get into the book, How to Be Single and Happy, Science-Based Strategies for Keeping Your Sanity While Looking for a Soulmate by Jennifer L. Taitz, I think it's important for us to spend a little time thinking about why the idea of being single is so awful. Why is the idea of being outside of a couple or a relationship such a terrible thought? And I get that there's the idea of companionship and love and having someone there to support you, and also hopefully having someone there to find your corpse one day so that the cat doesn't eat your face. But why is there so much fear? Why is there so much trepidation around this idea of being single? And I think a lot about the whole stereotype of the crazy cat lady, the woman who never married, who has a bunch of cats, and all of her love and attention and devotion and focus goes into caring for those feline friends. It's definitely an image of ridicule. We're not supposed to think very highly of the crazy cat lady. We're supposed to mock her. There's something wrong with her, that she can't get a relationship or that she would choose cats over a man. Because that's the typical story. There's no equivalent of a crazy cat man. Sometimes men are confirmed bachelors, but there's no real pejorative sense. And for my queer folks out there listening, I get it. It's sounding real heteronormative right now. But I think that that's because so much of how we think about any type of relationship is rooted in those stereotypes about relationships and gender. If we think about the stereotypes for gay men's relationships and lesbian women's relationships, so much of those stereotypes are rooted in the stereotypes that we have about men and women. So we talk about lesbians. What do they bring on a second date? They bring the U-Haul, because women are supposed to be the ones who are nesting, who are thinking about settling down. And you know, the old joke about what does a gay man bring on the second date? What second date? The idea that gay men are supposed to be more promiscuous and not looking for relationships and not trying to form those kinds of relationships. Those are tied to the stereotypes that we have about men and women in general, that men are much more focused on sexual pleasure, whereas women are much more focused on emotional connection and building relationships. And so then this stereotype of the crazy cat lady emerges, because if you're a woman and you're not in a relationship or you don't want to pursue a relationship, if that's not your primary focus, then you're not adhering to those gender norms. And because of that, you are considered dangerous. A woman who presents herself as not needing a man or a relationship to be whole and complete is acting out against those gender norms. And so we have to punish her. We have to make her into an object of ridicule. And I think that as gender norms change and as relationship styles develop and evolve and grow, we're trying to find new stories and new images. But also what happens is that it just opens up that crazy cat lady stereotype for more people. We become crazy cat people instead of crazy cat ladies. But we forget that that stereotype is about power. It's about saying that I am enough on my own. I can find other things to give my love and attention to. And ironically, as I was reading through How to Be Single and Happy, that sort of focus on other things than relationships is actually something that develops the type of personality and the type of resilience that makes you a better person once you enter into relationships. It makes you a better and more compassionate partner. And it makes you someone who has more to offer to a relationship. You have developed interests and you've developed hobbies, and there are interesting parts of your personality that you can share with another person or people, because we are going to talk a little bit about non-monogamy in this episode as well. So as I jump into this project, as I'm thinking about how I want this book to fit into the renovation and what I want to do with this overall concept, I want to give some power back to that idea of the crazy cat lady. I want to embrace that as a symbol of strength and of perseverance and of self-development and self-focus, not in a deeply selfish way, but in a way of taking care of yourself so that when you do enter relationships, you can be a better partner. And I think we also need to look back at our history to see what are the things that impact and influence our view of relationships now. And I guess if I'm going to do that, that means that I have to talk about my relationships. That means that I have to talk about the big primary relationships that I've had in my life and what they've meant and the lessons that I've learned. And I guess there's no better time than now. Part 2. Opening the X-File. All right, so if you're expecting this part of the podcast to be all about me spilling a bunch of tea about my ex-husband and talking about what a terrible person he was and all of the sordid details about our relationship, then I think you're going to be disappointed. I've done a lot of processing and a lot of writing about my marriage and my divorce. And what I'm more interested in terms of this book and in terms of thinking about dating and relationships is what I learned from that relationship. What I learned from the way that I handled that couple experience with him and what it tells me about myself and how I approach relationships. And one thing that I really know is that my ex-husband and I never should have gotten married. And this isn't one of those hindsight is 2020 things. This is foresight is 2020. I remember we had been together a little less than a year and he was already starting to talk about moving up to Grand Forks. And he was really kind of surprised when I didn't want him to move into my apartment. And I thought, no, first of all, I hadn't lived with somebody who wasn't a college roommate and I wasn't willing to let him move into the space that I had already established. I was only willing to move in, number one, if we had been together at least a year, and number two, if we found a new place that would be our own. My apartment was packed, so trying to fit another person and their stuff into that apartment would have been disaster. And maybe that would have been for the best. Maybe it would have caused us to break up earlier. But I remember that he was talking about moving up and he was trying to find somebody to stay with. And I was sitting in a park in East Grand Forks with my friend Kim and we were talking. And I told her, I don't know what to do. I feel like I shouldn't be in this relationship. I feel like we don't want the same things. We don't want a life that seems compatible with each other. Our goals and our ideas and the way we approach things are very different. But I didn't know how to have that conversation. I didn't know how to bring up the subject. And he was certainly not very communicative. So I thought, even if I bring it up, I don't know that we'll have a useful conversation. So I just went along with it. I just kept going. And I think one thing that I really haven't talked about publicly is just the fact that I stayed with him because I worried, what if I break up with him? And what if I never find anyone else? And I have struggled with low self-esteem and depression and all that kind of stuff and body image for years and years and years. And so I really kind of bought into that. I was in kind of a low place, even though I was in this new relationship. And I thought, well, it's not perfect. It's not great, but it's good enough, right? Maybe I should just settle for this. Maybe I should, be happy that the universe has sent me this thing that doesn't meet all my needs, but it meets some of them and it's kind of okay. And so I just didn't bring it up and I didn't talk about it. And the two of us just were not very good at communicating what we really wanted and what we expected out of life. I met him at a drag show and I think there was some element of the kind of sparkle and dazzle and maybe a couple cocktails of small time show business that really sort of gave him an incorrect understanding of what it would be like to be in a relationship with me. And when all that wore off, there I was and there he was, and we didn't really know what to do with each other and we didn't really know how to say, maybe this isn't working. And I guess, I don't know, maybe he thought that it was working longer than I did, but we just didn't know how to really have those conversations. So we just kind of stayed together and we just kind of did the things that you're supposed to do. So eventually we moved in together and then eventually he proposed and then we got married, and it was just that kind of progression. What's the goal here? And so we just sort of went along with it. We just kind of got carried along by it and we did the things we thought you were supposed to do, and we just kept on until we couldn't keep on any longer. And so even though I had some anger about how the whole breakup went down, I think that at the end of the day, I was lucky that he finally decided to pull the trigger, because he was the one who finally just said, this isn't working, we shouldn't be together, and took off. And I, instead of getting to a place of we should not be together and we should move apart, I just sunk deeper and deeper into my depression. And I was really struggling. The weekend before he left, I had a show in Bismarck. And I came home and he was working. He didn't go with me that weekend. And I was sitting at home and I was just in such a dark place. And I was sitting on the couch and I was just crying and crying to the point that I was exhausting myself. And I was trying to mentally do the math. And I really was trying to figure out, did I have enough time to clear out enough stuff from the garage, even if I just threw it out onto the lawn? And this was in November. So in the snow, in the cold, would I have enough time to clear enough space in the garage for me to drive my car in and shut the door and for me to not be alive any longer before he got home. I wanted to make sure that it would be something that I would have time to finish it. And that's really where I was at. Of all the times that I have been super depressed and that I've had self-harming thoughts, that was the first time that I was really sort of trying to work out the plan. And I eventually just took myself to bed. I just said, you're exhausted, go to bed, and you'll just come up with a plan for how to get through this in the morning. Just don't think about it. And just a couple days later, that's when I figured out that stuff in the basement had been sort of packed up. And we ended up having the conversation where he said that he was leaving. And so I think the anger that I had at that time was that he was so blind to how much I was struggling, that I was getting to such a point of desperation where I was really, truly, and very seriously thinking about ending my life, and that he couldn't see that. This is this man who's supposed to be my husband, that we stood in front of all of our friends and family and took vows and made all these promises, and he couldn't even see that I was dying. All of the anger and all of the sadness that I had wrapped up in that breakup was also mixed up with this feeling of relief that finally someone had said this thing that for 7 years neither of us were willing to say, and he finally was the one to say it. And once I got out of all the emotion of that, and once I processed through that and I did the writing that I did and really kind of thought about it, I realized that the regrets that I have about that relationship are that I didn't believe that I deserved better. Not that he was a bad person or that he was awful to me or didn't treat me well, none of that, but that we just weren't compatible. We weren't meant to be in that sort of relationship. But I had such a low self-image. I didn't understand and didn't believe that I deserved to have a relationship that was fulfilling, that I deserved to have a relationship that met my needs and that made me feel the way that I wanted to feel in relationship with another person. I really was worried that I would never find that. And even in some ways that I didn't deserve to find that somehow I wasn't worth having a real partnership. And so I just stayed in this thing because I thought, well, that's probably as good as it gets. And so the regret that I feel around that relationship isn't about the fact that my marriage ended or that relationship was quote unquote a failure, because it wasn't exactly a failure. It taught me a lot of things about what I actually want and need and desire in a partnership. The regret that I have is tied up in the fact that I didn't believe that I deserved a real partnership that was emotionally and sexually and intellectually and spiritually fulfilling, that I didn't believe that I deserved to be loved the way that I wanted to be loved. I spent 7 years of my life in that relationship, and that was so much time that I could have spent on learning to love myself and learning to find someone who would love me the way that I wanted them to love me. And the breakdown of that relationship and the after effects of that relationship absolutely influenced the partnerships that I've had afterwards. Part 3, The Pilot and the Puppy. Now, since my divorce, the two primary relationships that I've had since then have been about me experimenting with and learning more about non-monogamous relationships. For 2 years, I dated a guy who was studying to be a pilot. We met on OkCupid, and he was very clear and upfront that he was in a polyamorous relationship. So the structure of his relationship at that time is that he had a boyfriend, and the boyfriend had a wife. And they both lived down in the Twin Cities, and so he was looking for someone primarily for companionship. And for someone who was still pretty raw after a divorce, that sounded really good to me. This person wasn't going to be trying to move into my house. They weren't going to be trying to put a ring on my finger. They were going to be there for some companionship and some light casual dating. And that sounded fantastic. And he was fantastic. He's a wonderful guy. He's the only one of the people that I've dated that I've actually bothered or even tried to remain friends with. And it was really nice to have some low pressure companionship, especially with my crazy work and travel schedule. I had somebody who could take me to the airport, pick me up when I came home, spend a little time on the couch watching TV, do a little cuddling, do a little kissing, and it wasn't wasn't a ton of pressure. But in terms of the polyamory aspect of it, I don't think that we did polyamory very well. I think that as much as his relationships with his boyfriend and his boyfriend's wife were much more defined, I felt like I didn't know how I fit into the whole structure. I was just sort of this distraction from his real life. There wasn't any discussion about how I fit into that whole relationship structure. And there was no communication about the expectations about any other partners or any other activities that I might be taking part in. And so I felt like I was sort of missing from the whole equation. And I realized that even though I loved that companionship and that non-monogamy is something that makes sense to me both theoretically and in practice, that I'm not terribly good at polyamory if I don't have a primary partner. And once again, I found myself settling. I found myself not believing that I deserved something more or better tailored to my needs. There were so many times where I found myself getting frustrated because I felt like he wasn't giving me something that I needed, or he wasn't reacting to something the way that I wanted him to or needed him to, or that he wasn't in my life the way that I felt like he should be. And it's because I was putting unrealistic expectations on that relationship. We got into that relationship specifically because it was going to be a low pressure, low commitment relationship. And then I started putting all of these expectations on it that you would put on a primary partner. But I didn't feel comfortable talking about that. I didn't feel comfortable bringing up the idea that I wasn't feeling like my needs were being met, because I thought, well, the good stuff that you're getting from this, what if that goes away? And what if you don't find it again? So once again, I was letting my life be dictated by this sense of worthiness or a lack of worthiness. And on top of that, once again, we just weren't that compatible together. I have always sort of lived my life by the philosophy that bad decisions make good stories. And so I'm much more willing to just sort of go into weird situations and see what happens. And if it's not ideal, it's not ideal, but at least you had the experience. Whereas he is much more controlled and he likes to anticipate the outcome of a situation. It used to drive me crazy that he never wanted to go to movies until after he had read the reviews and he was pretty sure that he was going to have a good time. And I thought, even if you go see a shitty movie, it was still an interesting experience. It was a new perspective on the world. But there were so many movies that he refused to go to because the reviews just made it sound like he wasn't going to have a good time. And so why spend your time and your money on something if you're not going to have a good time? And I thought, but what if you love it? What if you and those reviewers just don't see eye to eye? And what if this is the story that you needed? I mean, I've always been much more touchy-feely about that kind of stuff. What if that's just something that's supposed to be in your life, and fuck what the critics say? And the one time that we had a real fight, because every once in a while he would sort of do something that would hurt my feelings or would sort of make me upset, but it was usually because I was putting too many expectations on the relationship, or I was being very sensitive about his very blunt way of communicating. And I mean that seriously. I don't mean that he was like an abusive asshole and I'm making excuses like, oh, I'm just too sensitive. There were times where I literally was just too sensitive. He is a very direct communicator, and there were times where I just wanted a little bit of fluff and I wanted him to see that I needed a little bit of fluff, and I didn't get my fluff and I got upset. But there was one time that we had a really kind of tense argument, and it was when I made him take me to the movie Collateral Beauty, because the minute I saw a preview for that, I was like, that movie is going to make me cry, and I want to see that with someone. I want to see that with my fella. I don't want to just go and be that weird dude crying in the back of a theater by yourself. I want him to take me and I want to have this moment with him. That movie was just so clearly not in his wheelhouse. That was so not his perspective, but he was a little bit mean about it. Like, he was a little bit dismissive of the emotional nature of my personality. And that was one of the only times that we had a real tense, I would almost call it a fight between us. And we still will sometimes make veiled references to Collateral Beauty and how each of us thinks the other is wrong about how they feel about that movie. But we just weren't compatible. I like a little bit of gratuitous emotion. I like a little bit of cheese. I like a little bit of softness. And I think that he was too rigid for me. And I also feel like sexually we weren't super compatible. That was definitely a problem with my ex-husband, and it was a problem with this relationship as well because he just wasn't as aggressive as I like. I am a boss bitch. I am in charge of my life from the time that I get up in the morning until I go to bed. I have built a life where I am in charge of almost every project that I have. My main job is taking charge of a classroom and training people on how to do their job and being in control of that classroom environment. I run my own website. I perform in shows where I control my performance and my costuming and my song selection. Even down to this podcast, I have control of my life, and I want that control everywhere but in the bedroom. In the bedroom, I want someone who's a little bit more aggressive, who's a little bit more dominant. And the pilot was so sweet, and he was so concerned with things like consent. And I get it that we don't do such a great job in our culture of teaching people, and especially men, about consent. And it's such an important issue, but there was so many times where he was just like, is this okay? Is this okay? How do you feel about this? Should we do this? And it was like, look, I'm tired of talking today. And have you met me? Like, I am a mouthy bitch. If I don't like something, I'm gonna let you know. I'm not going to feel pressured to do something I don't want to do. I mean, that's part of the conversations that we need to have around consent. What does consent look like and mean to you? And if there's a question, yes, you should always go towards that place of asking for consent and asking if somebody is comfortable. But it's also about actually getting to know your partner and understanding what level of comfort they have with you and how comfortable they are expressing whether or not they want to participate in certain things. And I have never had trouble forming an opinion. I'm gonna let you know. So just fucking pull my hair, slap my ass or something. I have to stop talking about it. I have to stop talking about it right now. You are in my house. We are both naked. The green light is on, sir. Just go for it. And if we run into a snag, we'll talk about it when we get there. And I've always had trouble finding that balance of somebody who is willing to be a little bit more flexible with me in our social interactions, because that's when I'm the boss bitch, and then is willing to be a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more take charge when the lights go out. And so while that was a frustration for me, it helped me refine the kind of things that I was looking for. And it helps me better understand why I sometimes have some difficulty with the puppy. Let's talk about the puppy. So the puppy is somebody that I've been seeing casually for the last 3 or so years. He owns his own business and he splits his time between Seattle and Phoenix, which are the two cities that I spend the most time in for my job. So we actually manage to get together fairly often when I'm traveling. I met him through an app called Growler, which is kind of like Grindr, but for bears and cubs and otters and puppies and all kinds of gay wildlife that you may encounter in the wild. And when I first met him, I didn't know really what a puppy was. And it didn't really come up in our first conversation. And so I didn't really think too much about it. He is a chaser, so he's into bigger guys, which means that he's very much attracted to my body type. And he's tall and very muscly, which means he's very much my physical type. And the first time that we hooked up, it was fantastic. And I kept his information. I added him to my favorites on the app so that when I was traveling, I could get together with him. Now, over the last couple of years, our relationship has sort of developed. It's still very much casual and hookup centered. And while that part of it hasn't changed, and that part of it has certainly gotten better, the emotional aspect has also changed and deepened. And so what I really appreciate about him is that he is 100% the best sex of my life, but he's also super cuddly and super sweet. And he knows when to be aggressive and rough, and he knows when to be soft and sexy and cuddly. And I think that his interest in puppy play has a lot to do with it, because what I've gathered from talking to him about it and through the research that I've done is that pup play is very much an offshoot of more general interest in leather and kink, bondage, that type of stuff. But like you would expect from something that's centered around puppies, is it's much more playful. It's much kinder and sweeter leather. A lot of times when you think about, or when I think about leather or kink or bondage, it can be kind of extreme and it can be sort of harsh and rough edges. And if you think about puppies, they're just sort of bouncy and fun. And it's sort of that perfect balance between the two. And so there certainly are the kink elements of masks and collars and harnesses and things like that. But so much of his persona is just sort of like a big friendly dog. He's just kind of energetic and enthusiastic and bright-eyed and very sweet. And when the moment's right, he turns into an alpha dog and he's in charge. And it's wonderful. And, you know, I said before, I didn't know a lot about puppies when we first started seeing each other. And it was actually kind of a surprise to me. The first time that we hooked up, it didn't really come up and I didn't think about it again. And the second time I noticed that when we would talk, you know, when he first got to my hotel room and as we're getting undressed and things like that, he started to work in a little woof here and there. So he would be talking about his day and just say, oh yeah, I had a busy day today. Woof, woof. And so it's good to be able to, you know, just sit back and relax a little bit. Oof. And so I noticed that that started to crop up a little bit more. And the more we got to know each other and the more familiar we became with each other, the more he sort of worked in those kind of mannerisms and into the bedroom as well. To the point that now, whenever he has an orgasm, there's sort of this snarly kind of growly sound that he does that simultaneously is so strange and so sexy. And believe me, even if I thought it was the weirdest thing I had ever heard, he is absolutely the best sex of my life. He can do the whole damn see and say barnyard if he wants to. He can moo, he can meow, he can quack. I don't give a shit. What kind of sound does a giraffe make? You can do that too. I don't give a shit. You just keep doing what you're doing. He is absolutely the perfect balance of what I'm looking for in a man, except for one small detail. He's married. Now, before you get all uppity and decide that I'm some side piece home wrecking whore, he and his husband are in an open relationship. I don't refer to it as polyamory because he doesn't really refer to it as polyamory, and as far as I know, his husband doesn't refer to it that way. But it has a lot of the same dynamics of a lot of the polyamorous relationships that I've seen. And so there's a lot of communication, there's a lot of boundaries, there's a lot of permission. I've never met his husband, but his husband knows about me, and before he comes to see me, he gets permission and they talk about it, and sometimes he's able to come see me and sometimes he's not. And that's part of how their relationship works. And that's the joy and the heartbreak of every time that I see him. Just like with the pilot, I start putting expectations on that relationship, even though I know what the boundaries are, even though I know how I fit into that whole equation because I am not the primary partner. I find myself ecstatic because the physical connection and the emotional connection is absolutely what I'm looking for. And I also find myself heartbroken because I am so aware of the limits on that relationship and what that relationship can give me. And so once again, I'm faced with the understanding that while he is a perfect representation of what I'm looking for in a partner, I'm looking for that combination. I'm looking for that balance and that representation in a primary partner for myself. That's what I truly deep down need and want, and that is absolutely what he is unable to give me. And so when it's great, and when it's not, it's devastating. And once again, I just can't get myself to walk away because I worry that I'll never find that balance in another person. I'll never find somebody who awakens me sexually that way and is also emotionally available. And it impacts how I approach dates and relationships because I always start comparing them to the puppy. I'll match with somebody on Tinder and I'll look at them and I'll start comparing them physically to the puppy. Or we start having a conversation and I start to compare that conversation. Is this doing for me what my conversations with the puppy do? And it's really impeding my ability to see the potential in new relationships. And so that's why I wanted to include this book in the renovation. I wanted to make sure that I could approach this single state that I'm not very comfortable in new ways and try to figure out how does this sexual relationship relationship that is at the same time both very fulfilling and also sometimes damaging? How does that fit into my larger life? How do I make that work so that I don't fall apart when he leaves? So that I can still enjoy his company and not feel like I'm limiting the opportunities that come into my life. And so I wanted to use this book as a way to help bridge that gap. Because right now I am single and definitely not happy. Part 4. So we're just fucked? So we're about 34 and a half minutes into this episode, and I'm finally getting around to talking about the book. I bet you thought I was never going to get here. So How to Be Single and Happy by Jennifer Taitz, Science-Based Strategies for Keeping Your Sanity While Looking for a Soulmate, is divided into 2 sections. So this section is going to be about part 1, which is the misery formula, why looking for Mr. or Ms. Right is making you feel so wrong. So this is the part where she tells us all about all the terrible, stupid things that we're doing wrong to fuck up our lives. And in the introduction, she talks about the idea of the emotion brain, that we have our rational brain and then we have our emotion brain. And our emotion brain is something that's really powerful and it controls a lot of our thinking, especially around relationships, around dating. And that's the one that we can start to tell some of these really terrible stories to. Our rational brain is the one that can kind of talk its way through a situation and say, just because you're alone now doesn't mean you're going to be alone forever. And then the emotion mind jumps in and is like, actually, you're gonna die alone with 15 cats. So you better get a Prime Now subscription to cat litter, loser. And so in the first section, she lays out 4 main traps that people fall into when they're thinking about dating and they're thinking about relationships: running on the husband treadmill, ruminating, regretting, settling, suppressing, and other avoidance moves. So those are the 4 traps that people typically fall into. You'll notice it's called the husband treadmill. She does kind of make some references to the fact that this book technically could apply to anybody. It could be men, women, straight relationships, queer relationships, but then it's very clear that it's written for women. All of the references are to husbands, the husband treadmill. Pretty much all of the patients that I've run into in this book are women, except for one. She had one guy, and his issue wasn't necessarily about relationships. He was married and he was happily married, but he just kept randomly thinking about suicide. And that's in the second part. We're going to talk more about the strategy she talks about, but I was like, one of these things is not like the other, Sesame Street. Everybody else is worried about, are they going to die alone? If they get out of this bad relationship, are they going to be able to find a better one? Are they too old to find a relationship? All these sorts of things. And then there's this guy who's like, I'm generally pretty happy, but I might want to throw myself out that window. So I wasn't entirely sure how he fit into the old equation. But right away in the section about the husband treadmill, she mentions that she's assuming that somebody reading this book is reading it for one of 2 reasons. Either they're single and they're feeling disappointed by dating or convinced you'll never meet your person, or you're unhappily coupled but you dread being single again. Obviously, I fall into the first one. But I thought it was interesting that she also spent quite a bit of time talking about people who were in bad relationships or weren't feeling fulfilled or weren't feeling like their current relationship was meeting their needs, but they were so scared of being single that they didn't want to end that relationship. They didn't want to break up with their current partner. And that is really powerful to me, that some people are so scared of being single, that the idea of being single is so awful that somebody would rather stay in an unfulfilling, unemotionally responsive relationship than to break up and be single. I mean, I don't know why that should surprise me, because when I think back to where I was at with my ex-husband, I think there was some of that, is I really just kind of stayed in that relationship because I thought, well, at least he seems to like me, and I don't know if anybody else will ever like me, so I suppose I should just stay with him. And look where it got me. It got me to a point where I was, in the most dark, depressed place I had ever been, and it literally almost killed me. And that's really powerful to think about now, that I was more willing to stay in that relationship and potentially end my life than I was to say it's time to walk away from this, because that meant being single. It meant being alone. It meant confirming so many of these thoughts that were knocking around in my emotion brain that I just didn't want to be true. So the first part of this book is all about what we're doing wrong, and it's talking about all these different things that we do, and then backing it up with science. And it turns out that science tells us that basically we're just fucked. Because not only is what we're doing not contributing to us finding partners and relationships in and of itself, it's also contributing to an overall mindset that makes it less likely for you to find those partners and relationships in the future. So not only is it bad for you in the moment, it's also bad for you long term. So one example is the idea of ruminating. So if something negative happens to you and you dwell on it, scientists have found that rumination, that dwelling on the negative experience, impacts your ability to do other things. So it's not just that it affects your mood or it affects your health, it affects your ability to complete logic puzzles, and it can impact your short-term memory and make it harder for you to complete memory exercises. And child, I am the queen of the dweller. So I read that and I was just like, oh, fuck. Can I just give up now? That's what I do. I am a dweller. I like her word for it, ruminating, a little bit better, but I am a dweller all day long. And I'm interested to see what part 2 of this book is like, because so far it's telling me what I'm doing wrong, but it's not giving me a lot of practical solutions. And that was the problem that I had with the previous books, is that there was all of this information about here's what you should be doing, here's how you should change your life, but there was no actual practical sort of steps. And so I think one of the things that I like about this book is that it's based on science, it's based on research. And so there's going to be actual scientifically sound things that you can do to improve your life. It's not going to be like a relationship magnet, but it's going to be something that allows you to work through your thoughts about being single without causing yourself more harm or without doing things that aren't contributing to your greater good. But I just read all this stuff and right now I'm feeling kind of discouraged because there's so many patterns here that I do. I mean, I absolutely get into that place where I'm like, you'll never find anyone, you'll be alone forever, better just get some cats. And I give into that. And the more I focus on that, the more it's hard for me to see outside of that. And the more it's hard for me to understand the different options that are available to me and how do I make myself a better, more interesting partner for a potential future relationship. I'm not focused on that. I'm focused on all the things I'm doing wrong and all of the ways that everything that I've done before has led to this point. And a lot of her practice is built on mindfulness. And that's something that I struggle with. And I keep getting this message over and over again that I need to meditate. At some point, I am just going to have to listen because every time I turn around, meditation comes up. Every one of the books that I've looked at so far, Jen Sincero's and Lee Crutchley's, they both mention meditation. The psychic that I went to on New Year's, when Amy and I went to get New Year's readings, talked about meditation and how I needed to do meditation. I need to just get the message and realize that I need to focus more on mindfulness. I need to be more present in the moment and in my current circumstances and being kinder to myself and recognizing that my current circumstances are not as bleak as I'm making them seem when I'm thinking about them. And also that the things that I don't like can change in the future. You know, none of us really knows what's going to happen in the future. So the more we tell ourselves, this isn't going to happen, this isn't possible, we don't know that. We don't know who's going to stumble into our paths. We're just so caught up in how we're feeling about the present moment. And rather than just focus on the present moment and try to fix it and try to improve it, we extrapolate that moment into the future and just decide that because I'm feeling bad now, I'll feel bad forever. And I think that I always knew that that was bad. I mean, I think that I'm smart enough to know that that's not a good coping strategy. But I think that this book is really pushing me to say, you need to address that. You need to address mindfulness and having this attitude of gratefulness. You need to be aware of the things that are in your life and not just focusing on the things that you feel like are missing. Part 5, The Magic 8 Ball. All right, so the second half of the book is called The Sane Solution, Living Freely in the Times of Tinder, Ghosting, and Exes on Instagram. Now this section is where she gets into a lot more of the actual practical problem solving. And this is the part that really struck me as being useful, but it also kind of grated on me because I had a hard time being snarky about it, because that was my big problem with the previous two books, is I felt like there wasn't a lot of concrete solutioning. You know, there was exercises to draw yourself as an emoji, or you had Jen Sincero just telling you to manifest it into reality. I always get a parking spot. Why does your life suck? fuck, you know, that kind of bullshit. Whereas this is actual like research and practical steps. And so I was like, oh shit, now I got to do the work. And so right at the beginning of this section, she's got the same image of a broken heart that she had in the first section, with running on the husband treadmill, regretting, ruminating, settling, suppressing, and other avoidance moves. But then she's got an arrow down to another heart, and this heart is whole, and it says watching your mood, focusing on your values, building your community, participating in activities and living in the moment, accepting your emotions, giving to others, and seeing your thoughts. So there's a lot of reframing from the very beginning of this. She says, from an early age, most of us are taught to master getting. We try to get happy, get on the team, get good grades, get the cool stuff, get the guy or girl, and get the money. It may even be true that getting what we want makes us feel happy, at least momentarily. The thing is, the getting quest can also guarantee misery. And that absolutely is where I've been the last couple of years. I have talked before about being an emotional eater and an emotional shopper. And that, especially in terms of the shopping, makes so much sense to me. You know, I joke with my mom about retail therapy and how if I have a tough day, I would go and buy something from Sephora, or I would order something online from one of my favorite indie brands. And that absolutely has led to the sort of makeup obsession that I have now. And I'm so glad that the trend on YouTube now is low buys and no buys, because I really was just sort of watching these YouTube videos and buying all of these products that people were talking about and using because I felt like it would make me happy and I felt like it would make me feel fulfilled. And it was a momentary rush, and I would get them and I would swatch them and I'd take pictures and maybe I'd review them for my website. But there's so many of those products that now are just sitting in drawers and not getting used. And so I thought, I need to find a way to not just acquire more makeup, but I need to rediscover my love of makeup. I buy makeup not just to have it. I buy it because I legitimately love playing with makeup and I love painting a face and I love the artistry of makeup, but I've lost so much of that. And so much of the time when I have to get ready for a show, it feels like a burden. It's like a chore where, oh, I have to get ready for this show. And I used to love it. I used to love experimenting and playing and doing all of these different things. And I realized that that's part of this reframing that she's talking about. You have to figure out, what does the actual joy in your life come from and how do you reclaim that? How do you not just keep yourself busy, but keep yourself engaged and keep yourself in love with your life? One of the big takeaways that I had from this section of the book was the idea of refining your values. I think that when we talk about what we want in a partner or what we want in a relationship, it's really easy to focus on sort of a laundry list of what you want that person to be or to bring to the relationship. And how much time do we really spend thinking about what you want to bring into the relationship? What are you offering? What do you value and what do you care about? And that doesn't necessarily mean like a type, because I certainly have a physical type, but I think that what really resonated for me here and what really got into some of the uncomfortable places about my regrets about previous relationships is related to the fact that if I really dug down and thought about what I value, what my core values are, and what I want out of life, that those relationships didn't meet those core values. One of her quotes from the book, she says, "Short-lived bursts of happiness that happen after an amazing date or fun night out with friends can't compete with the more enduring sense of meaning that arises when you live according to your values. That latter isn't always instantaneous. If you saw me sitting at the library writing this book at this very moment, I'd look more pensive than elated. Yet I know that long term, I'd rather be here at my laptop than sipping a cucumber drink at a beach resort. Sharing teachings in psychology feels purposeful to me, and the opportunity to write this book is something I've strived for, unlike relaxing poolside." She talks about getting out of your comfort zone and trying different activities and not assuming outcomes of activities. I think it's really easy when you're trying to get out there and when you're trying to find someone to just sort of do what you've always done and to assume that there isn't going to be an impact or a use to taking part in activities that might be a little outside of your comfort zone. And she talks about not violating your actual preferences and your values. If you are 100% not a sports fan and you decide to join a softball league, that might be something that's outside of your principles. But when we have the opportunity to go for a night out with friends or to go to a new place that might have new people around, and we just sort of decide that nothing good can come of that. I'm not going to meet anybody. That's not the purpose. And we just sort of look at our magic 8 ball and we say, is this where I'm going to find my true love? My sources say no. Okay, let's skip it. She goes on to say, it's possible to stretch yourself without dismissing your legitimate preferences. When I was single, I pushed myself to do things that were out of my comfort zone, like going to a dinner party where I didn't know anyone except the gracious 70-year-old host and where I ended up meeting people I liked. In contrast, scheduling activities where the only redeeming element was the possibility of finding a partner didn't build my self-compassion or fuel my hope. You know, one thing that I remember hearing when I was growing up, directed at women specifically, was that single men could smell desperation a mile away. And so if you just plan things thinking, maybe I'll meet the love of my life out at the bar tonight, like that's not the point. You go out, whether it's to a bar or to a social activity or a dinner party or whatever it is, you go because you feel like the activity is going to give you something or you're going to enjoy your time there. If you're just doing it because you're thinking, maybe I'll meet the love of my life, what I think you're doing, and what according to this book science thinks you're doing, is you're actually sabotaging yourself, because you start putting all of these expectations on every single person that you meet, and you're immediately evaluating each person about, is this the love of my life? Is this the love of my life? And so if they all come up short, then you start feeling like the time is wasted and you're not in the moment, you're not mindful, you're not present, and you're not enjoying that experience. And that's not the kind of energy that draws anyone. Nobody wants to be around somebody who's always having a terrible time because there isn't a knight in white shining armor just sitting there waiting for them when they go out to coffee on a Tuesday. And so I kind of joke, but I also see myself in that a little bit, because I think that there are times where I fill so much of my time with activities that make me feel fulfilled and that I enjoy, but they're also very solitary activities. And when I think about going out and being social, sometimes it's hard to convince myself to do that because I think, oh, I've got website updates to make. I can work on a podcast episode. There's all of these different creative things that do make me feel fulfilled, but they don't increase my connection. They don't contribute to me feeling closer to other people, and they certainly don't put me in closer proximity to potential partners. I mean, it's a lovely story to think that your next boyfriend is just going to show up in your living room while you're working on a podcast episode, but if that happens, he's a fucking burglar. So that's probably not going to happen. Mr. Right isn't just going to wander into my house. And if he does, he's a criminal. So I need to loosen up how I think about my social calendar. I need to think about how to structure my time so that I'm still meeting those creative needs, but I'm also engaging with people and connecting with people. And not just for the sake of, oh, to find a partner or to find someone to date or whatever it is, but also just to bring more of that connection. Because I think that that's one thing that this book really hits home about, is that being in a relationship or not being in a relationship doesn't determine if you're lonely. And you would think that I would have recognized that before reading this book. I mean, the loneliest time of my life was that last 6 months or so with my husband. I was in a relationship. I was in a long-term relationship. I was living with somebody. I was married to somebody. And I have never been more lonely than I was at that moment. And you would think I would have learned that lesson, but somehow it still managed to pass me by. So there's lots of techniques and tips in this book about what to do when you're feeling like you're getting stuck in a negative pattern. And so there's lots of practical things, like if you're struggling with self-criticism, learn to develop self-compassion. And she has a whole section on how to do that. If you're struggling with feeling of worthlessness, learn to contribute to others. If you're struggling with believing that nothing is going well, you can learn to practice gratitude for the things that you do have. And she has lots of very practical strategies here. And that's what I like about this book. This is the first time that a book has really sort of resonated for me. And it's also the first book that makes me think that I probably should be in therapy. I probably shouldn't just be trying to manhandle this together on my own. I really appreciate that there's so much practical guidance in here, because I think that I get stuck in those negative thought patterns. And she talks about how the science supports that if you continue with those negative ideations, you get stuck in them. And not only do you get stuck in them, but they affect your ability to do other things, and they affect your ability to make decisions, and they affect your ability to remember things and to take joy in other activities in your life. And so there's one more quote from this section that I wanted to share because I thought it was really powerful. And she says, once you can live your life without if-onlys and instead fill your minutes, hours, and days with activities and people and goals you find meaningful, you'll find that you're able to do more, feel more, and surprise yourself by the joy and beauty you'll begin to notice all around you. It's time to start turning those if-onlys into a phrase I think is much more effective and mindful. If not now, when? And that's such a beautiful thought. If only is a thing that I get stuck on all the time. If only I had this, I would be happier. If only this had gone right. If only I hadn't fallen for this, whatever. If only I hadn't spent 7 years married to somebody that I never should have been with in the first place. It's so easy to get caught up in regrets and to be focused on if onlys, and how much more empowering is it to look at your life and say, these are the things that I don't like. And so if not now, then when? If this isn't the position that I want to be in, how do I get to that position? How long is it going to take me and what do I need to do? It's much more empowered. It's much more impactful. And so we can put away that magic 8-ball and use some of the techniques that are in this book to actually make improvements. Part 6, Song for the Lonely. Spoiler alert, if you're going to read this book, it's not just about finding a relationship or how to be happy as a single person until you do. This book is about emotional intelligence. Now, I have to say, I cringed a little bit inside every time I used that phrase, emotional intelligence, because I had a boss that was really terrible, and she would harp on and on about emotional intelligence, and we have to develop our emotional intelligence. But it was clear to pretty much anybody who ever met her that she had no emotional intelligence. All she did was like break down relationships and burn bridges and cause problems. Not that I'm still bitter, obviously. But that's what the meat of this book and what the takeaways from this book are all about, is how to develop more of an emotional intelligence, how to work on improving yourself and reducing your feelings of loneliness so that you're in a better space to attract and get into connection with the type of people that you should be in connection with. You know, she has a quick aside about whether or not hooking up is a good option for you. And she acknowledges that for some people, if you're really not looking for a commitment, if you're not looking for a relationship, but you crave that sort of physical contact, if you're being absolutely true with yourself and if you are staying true to your core values and that's something that makes sense to you and gives you joy, then yes, you should do that. But most people will do that trying to fast track their way to a relationship. They'll jump into bed earlier thinking that that will lead to a sort of instant relationship. But a relationship isn't a styrofoam cup of ramen noodles. They take work and they take development and they take investment. Rather than just hooking up with somebody and hoping it'll develop into something, why not focus on developing yourself and making yourself into a more well-rounded, interesting, attractive person, somebody who has something to offer in a relationship? And why don't you focus on managing those emotions? And that's something that I struggle with every damn day. I am an emotional beast. I have such a hard time with how I want to navigate that emotional minefield. And she talks about it, and she talks about this strategy of ways to manage an emotion at every stage. So from the very beginning, before you've even had the emotion, into the after effects after you've had the emotion. So looking at your vulnerabilities, what are you vulnerable for? What's likely to kick off an emotion? And how do you add positive things into your life to counteract that before it even starts? Because once you get into an emotion, it can be harder to get yourself out of it than if you circumvent it at the very beginning. Looking at a situation, how do you problem solve? If this is something that you know makes you feel sad or makes you feel lonely, what are some things that you can do to improve that situation? How do you problem solve it? Interpretation, how do you check the facts and the mindfulness of your thoughts? Is the emotion really as bad as you think it is, or are you interpreting a situation with a negative outlook? So if one date went bad, are you saying, I'm going to be alone forever? Well, why are you going to be alone forever because this one date went bad? What are the facts? What's the mindfulness of your thoughts? Are you thinking about this situation, this moment, or are you thinking about how this one moment is going to somehow define everything in your future for the rest of your life? What are the changes in your body, your action and urges? Notice what they are and do the opposite. That was something that I thought was really useful. That idea of sometimes it's going to be hard and it's going to be shitty, but you do it anyway. Sometimes you just want to lay on the couch and watch Netflix. And so you counteract that by getting up and going for a walk or going to the gym. Sometimes you just want to lay in your bed and listen to sad music. So instead you go out to a dance club with your friends and you order drinks and you laugh. And so it's not the easy thing, but it's the thing that's going to be the most useful and the most right for you. If you're in an emotion, observing the emotion, how does that emotion make you feel? How does it make make your body react? How do you describe that emotion? And how do you describe it accurately? So you're feeling sad, but is this the worst sadness that you've ever had? Where are you on a scale of 1 to 10? And then after you've had the emotion, what are the after effects? How can you practice mindfulness so that you don't get stuck in that negative ideation? So you don't get stuck in perpetuating that mindset of focusing on the loneliness or focusing on the sadness or whatever the negative emotion is, so that it impairs your ability to find and rediscover joy in the rest of your life. And that is so powerful. And I think that this book has really kind of reinvigorated my interest in this project, because I think those first 2 books, there were some useful things in them, but they were so disappointing overall that I was starting to worry, like, am I going to get through 17 episodes of this? And this one is so much more practical and so much more useful to me. And I think that even as I'm reading through the rest of the books, this will give me some advice and some strategies for being mindful and managing even how I feel about those books. So I hope that you enjoyed this walkthrough. I definitely recommend this book, How to Be Single and Happy. If you're stressing about your relationships, this is something to look at, especially if you're very practical minded. I am a grounded Capricorn, and so I needed those practical solutions. I didn't want drawing activities and word finds and shit like that. I just wanted somebody to say, here's some ways that you can help make this situation better, so that when that next Tinder connection ghosts on you, or you go on yet another bad first date, you can remember that those things don't define you, and they don't define the happiness of your future. What's going to define you is the choices you make and how you react to the life that you're living. And if you do decide to pull away for a while and get a couple of cats, you know what? Maybe cats aren't so bad. Maybe that time away will help you reflect, and the cats will give you somewhere to focus your love while you really try to figure out what's meaningful and what's useful to you in your life. Because who's afraid of the crazy cat lady? No damn buddy. This episode is dedicated to Cassidy, the best first date I never had. Part 7, If God is a DJ. The opening quote for this episode was read by Trevor D., a radio personality from the Grand Forks area that I have known for many years. He was actually the DJ at our drag shows for a long, long time, and I figured it was perfect to have him as part of this episode because I always referred to him as my heterosexual, non-sexual life partner. If you want to find out more about what Trevor is up to, you can always find him on Facebook. Or if you want to get a little taste of his personality, you can go to Half Brothers Brewing Company in Grand Forks, North Dakota. It's right on 3rd Street, 1 block north of Demers, and they recently released a brand new beer flavor named after Trevor and his on-air sidekick, RJ. Trevor is a great guy, a wonderful DJ, and it has been a pleasure to have him be part of this podcast.
Miss Jaye, The Renovation is a 17-episode limited series podcast presented by Champagne Dreams Productions. While we're all here to have fun, mental health is a serious issue. Nothing in this podcast series should be taken as medical advice, and listening to podcasts or reading self-help books is not a substitute for proper mental health care. If you or someone you know is considering suicide, please contact the Suicide Prevention Hotline at 1-800-273-8255 or visit suicidepreventionhotline.org for more information. I love all of my Champagne Dreamers out there. Stay safe and stay alive.
This episode of Miss Jaye, The Renovation includes royalty-free music from bensound.com. This episode includes the following tracks in the order in which they were heard: Clear Day, Enigmatic, November, Sexy, Dreams, A Day to Remember, Cute, and Summer. For these and more great royalty-free tracks, don't forget to visit bensound, that's BEN sound.com. Miss Jaye, The Renovation is written and directed by Chris M. Stoner and is a Champagne Dreams production.